thank you for everybody who's joining us tonight. And obviously, thank you to our panel. When the idea came up, I had asked Charley Sullivan to assemble a panel of people that represented rowing across many sections. And so he, typical Charley, you have outdone yourself and come up with a great panel of people that are very representative of so many people and ways, and just exciting to finally be doing this. And one of the things I would like to say is first, thank you for all of you to join us tonight. And also say to everybody out there that let's make this just the first step, the beginning. Like, this is not a one-off, just a webinar, and we check off a box. Let's keep going with this and create resources and platforms for everybody to be able to make their boathouses safer and more welcoming, and to let everybody out there who we share the sport with know that they're not alone and we're all together. So Charley Sullivan is our moderator tonight. And we, rather than go through the entire list of the panelists and introduce everybody at once, I think we're going to do that as we're going along. Is that correct, Charley?
I think we're going to go through just quickly and do a very short ID, but not at length.
Well, then let's get right to it.
We'll say more about themselves as they do their little bits.
Great. Well, I'm going to turn it over in your capable hands and look forward to it. Thanks.
Great. So thanks for joining, folks. I'm Charley Sullivan. I'm an assistant coach. Sorry, I should not promote myself. I'm an assistant coach at the University of Kansas. And I am an openly gay man and have been my entire career, which is going on 30 plus years. And my pronouns are he, him, and his. Mac, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Mac. I row for Ithaca College, and I have been a long time out gay woman, but now I'm basically questioning my gender. So I use she, her for now, and that's appropriate for this panel, but that might change. So yeah, happy to be here.
Cool, thanks. Rebekah?
Hi, I'm Rebekah Armstrong. I just finished my last year of eligibility at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as a bisexual woman, but mainly a Black bisexual woman, and I'm excited to be here. And I'll be coaching as a fifth-year coach at UW-Madison this fall.
And Holly Metcalf.
Hi, everyone. I am the varsity open weight women's coach at MIT. This will be my 14th year there. I identify she, her, hers, and am an openly gay woman.
Thanks, Holly. Craig Wu.
Hello, everyone. My name is Craig Wu. I am a master's rower, currently located in DC with DC Strokes, originally from Chicago, Illinois, where I was on a team, a gay team there.
Awesome. Charlotte.
Hi, everyone. I'm Charlotte Smith. I was born and raised on the East Coast, spent most of my life there, and then just moved out to California this September to coach with UC San Diego. I am a lesbian woman. It was a long journey, but I finally figured it out, and I'm happy to be here and share my experiences today.
Great. Lowell McNicholas.
Everyone, I'm Lowell. I currently coach at Wisconsin for the men's program, and I did my undergrad at Wisconsin and rowed there as well. And my pronouns are he, him, and his.
Nick Parker, or as I have to say to my phone when I call him, Nitch Lee Parker.
I am Nick Lee Parker from Missouri. I am also part Cherokee and part Choctaw. I'm an openly gay man, and I coach the Columbia Lightweight Men in New York City.
And since he won't claim it, he's won 2 of the last 3 lightweight national championships.
We've had some good fun.
There you go. Linda Muri.
My name's Linda Muri. You can see my pronouns on the screen. I've been coaching for about 25, maybe 30 years. I spent 20 years coaching Division I collegiate rowing, 16 of it with men and 4 of it with women. And I will draw a little on that a little bit. I actively compete as a master's and still doing some coaching. Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Linda. Liam.
Perfect. My name is Liam. Reiterate, I use he, him pronouns. I'm a proud bisexual trans man. I finished my rowing career in 2016 when I graduated from Duke after spending 4 years on their women's team. But you know I still hit the erg all the time, and I keep my eyes peeled for North Carolina Masters teams.
Coach Harris.
I'm Kevin Harris. I'm the head coach of the University of Tulsa. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a heterosexual male. And I have been the head coach at Tulsa for 18 years, originally coming from T.C. Williams in the Washington metropolitan area.
Rafi.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rafi Teva. My pronouns are they, them, their. I am currently the para and military program manager at CRI up in Boston, as well as a Team USA para coach. I am queer, trans, and non-binary.
There you go. And if you don't know what any of these terms are, put it into the chat room. I'm sure there are folks who can help answer. So that'd be a great sidebar for just learning. If you don't know something, don't be afraid to ask. Simone Azure.
Good evening. My name is Simone Azure. I am currently in Chicago. I'm a master's rower with North Suburban, and I am a learn to row coach for Chicago Rowing Union. I'm an American Indian from the Turtle Mountain tribe, and I've been rowing for probably 10 or 12 years. I'm happy to be here. Welcome, everybody.
And before rowing, Simone was an elite athlete at going to Olympic trials in, was it Taekwondo?
Yes. 1988 Taekwondo.
There you go. So we've tried to put together a group here today that really does demonstrate what intersection looks like. And I think that that's appropriate for a discussion on LGBTQ issues, because so many things come together when we talk about the things that affect our life, right? Clearly gender does, not just in terms of sexuality, the people that you might find attractive, but also in terms of self-identity. And those two things are some separate stuff. And we come from multiple parts of the country. We come with multiple ethnic and heritage backgrounds, speaking multiple languages in our homes and some stuff like that. So we really are a place that can come together. And I want this to be an example for the rowing community that diversity exists already in our community of rowers. Perhaps we don't have enough. Perhaps we need to make sure, not perhaps, we don't have enough. And we do need to make sure that we're doing that. But it's something that's already here, and we have folks who already know, and we need to build from that. And it's part of what we're hoping to be here today to do as we start this. So we're going to move fairly quickly, but before we really get going, we'd like to take a short moment. Some of you may have seen news about Angela Madsen, who was a lesbian rower who was trying to row across the Pacific and who died in that possibility. And none of us here knows her well enough to feel that we can speak about her, but we do want to know that she is a member of our community, and that and some folks who I do know say that she was real kick-ass. And so we just like to take a brief moment to remember her or think about her. Okay, thanks. So here's the outline of what we're going to do, just so you'll know what's coming your way. Some of us are old as dirt on here. We've been around a long time, and we started rowing in this deep ancient time called the 1980s. So some of us are going to start talking a little bit about what rowing was like in the 1980s, because there's been massive change in some ways about rowing as a sport. So that's where we're going to start. Then we're going to go into a round about some stories of exclusion, ways that we have not been included in the rowing community and things that have gone. To counter that or to move from that, we're going to go into stories of inclusion, friendship, and home. We're going to have a third section, which we think is really important to have, about gender identity and gender issues in rowing. Just sort of quickly, USRowing has one of the most progressive policies about gender inclusion that was put in place several years ago. And we think it's important that everyone listening to this knows what that policy is, knows what the implications are for rowing. And we have folks who can talk here from their own experience about what it's like to be trans in rowing. And we also are going to do some analysis about how gender actually affects gay men and lesbians differently, and men and women in the sport differently, not to create too much of a dichotomy in a space where we're trying to talk about gender as a continuum. And then fourth, we also think it's really very important that, and we want to acknowledge and amplify the work that happened last Friday in USRowing and had been working previously. Last Friday was simply an expression of stuff that folks have been feeling for a long time by the Black Coaches and Rowers Forum. If you have not watched the video of that, I really urge you to. This is Black members of our community talking bravely, talking clearly about their experience in our sport. And Chris Chase is going to put up the link to that in the chat. So if you don't have time, or if you haven't had time, take 2 hours, listen, think. And we want to amplify that because there was a very important concept that came in there which made sense to us here, and that is, how is rowing home? How are we at home in our houses? How are we at home on our teams? And so we're gonna talk about how that is, but sort of a lot of us being coaches, we're also gonna come up with something we do all the time, creating a checklist of things that we have to do to get on the water safely, right? So some of us are just going to talk about various very concrete things that can be done to move forward. And then we'll have a few just little things at the end, but that is where we're going to go. And we hope that's good for folks here. If you have questions, please put them into the chat, and Chris will be monitoring them. And as appropriate, or as we have time, because there are a lot of folks, we'll try and get to some of those, but we're just going to reinforce that this is not a one-off. This is going to continue to happen. And we're going to continue to have this work happening and rowing on all sorts of levels. So, so thanks. So when we met yesterday as a group, there was some story sharing, there was some life that got done. And I feel humbled to ask Holly Metcalf to be our first speaker. Holly is an Olympian. She was training for the 1984 games when I was rowing at Princeton, and my coach was her coach. So we actually raced, or we actually did workouts against each other then. But in my entire career, Holly Metcalf has just been always there as a light and a grounding presence. But that groundedness comes from experience and pain and difficulty. And that's something I think we want to get across as why we're so strong, is because we've been through a lot. So Holly, would you tell us what it was like for you rowing in the 80s when you started going?
Sure, thank you. And again, thanks everyone for joining us. Always feels good not to be alone. So just, I'm gonna give a little context and some personal story, mostly because when I started rowing, it was the late 70s, early 80s, and where psychology and psychiatry was at that point is really crucial to understand. I'm just trying to put my story in context, which I think will really help with all of our stories. So I'm 62, I was born 58, and at that time, issues around trauma, childhood abuse, alcoholism, depression, those were not talked about unless there was some extreme thing that happened. I happened to grow up with a neglectful mom, which I totally understand why, but it definitely put me in a very interesting beginning in life, which was full of temper tantrums, physically violent, saying things are wrong. But that was treated as a mental disorder, that I didn't have enough air when I was born, or all this stuff. So from the get-go, I felt like something was terribly wrong. Became very quiet. Didn't voice any needs, because that seemed to be a very bad thing to do as a kid. So as I went along, I was clearly a very, very strong athlete. My kinesthetic self is where that saved my ass, having that confidence. And when I got to college, I was recruited to play other sports, but introduced to rowing. And here, for the first time, it was demanded I be myself. It was demanded I be physically, mentally strong, and to not hide. And at that time, my sexuality was awakening. I was very confused. Basically had been told, you know, it's too bad you were born female, you're such a good athlete, making it feel like I have more male than female, and what's up with that. So I sought therapy, and the college sent me to somebody that they sent all their students to. And without knowing it, at that time, in the late 70s, early 80s, homosexuality was listed in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Up until 73, I've got to look at my notes. Up until 73, it was listed as a mental disorder. And then the American Psychiatric Association got together, and obviously these issues had been coming up more and more. And they took a vote about removing that totally from the DSM manual. So 5,000, almost 6,000 psychiatrists voted to remove it, and almost 4,000 to retain it. So you would have thought that would have been out of there, but no. There was a compromise, and it was replaced with sexual orientation disturbance for people in conflict with their sexual orientation. And not until 1987 was it totally removed. So I only say that because that's the context that I was in going into see this therapist, who turned out to be a Freudian therapist. So there was very little talking, but a lot of raised eyebrows and, you know, all kinds of things signaling you are sick. Finally, somebody in some close friends said, you need to see someone else. There's a real break going on psychiatry, and you are not sick. And you can find therapy to help you figure out what you want, who you are, and that's what happened. And so the most important thing for me to remember, it's not an Olympic gold medal at all. It is the first couple of weeks of rowing, being in a boat, and that feeling of 4 people setting the boat for me so that I could be powerful and feel that. And all of us then stopping, I need to set that boat so this person feels that power, feel the wind change, hear the sounds change, and just the joy of that. And today, when I watch very, very fast boats rowing, I watch the warm up and how much attention people pay when they're setting the boat, and do they remember what a gift and privilege that is for someone to feel that strength. And what the hell is our sport doing by exclusion when the sport is all about who you need to become and who we can be as a whole? I'll shut up now.
Thanks, Holly. Now y'all know why we started. Just awesome, and we'll go from there. I think that image of I'm an Olympic gold medalist, but the most important thing was when 4 women set a boat for me so I could be strong. That's going to get used this fall in coaching, I guarantee you, assuming we can get on the water. Kevin Harris, what were the 80s adjacent like for you?
Well, really interesting. I mean, you know, I started rowing at T.C. Williams as an 8th grader in 1983. And I have to say, Holly Metcalf, you have always been one of my heroes. And I remember watching that 8 on TV because I had chicken pox that summer and I couldn't row. So I was glued to the TV as she took that boat down the river. You know, my experience obviously is that of a Black male, and you know, always being a little bit outside the norm. And that is one of the things we're going to talk about later, is why is the norm the norm? But in terms of, you know, what it was to know about LGBTQ issues, to me, they didn't exist because I lived in a home where my father was a preacher. And we didn't talk about those things, and those things were not present. And truthfully, it wasn't until I became a coach that I started to understand that this was a thing, that there were people who loved each other, who didn't happen to be man and woman, right? And I think I don't know if Jeannie is on this, but I want to give a shout out to my first boss, Jeannie Friedman, as a college coach, who was a longtime coach at Mount Holyoke College, which Holly also has an affiliation. It was from Jeannie that I learned what being in a loving relationship was. And of course, she is a lesbian woman. But that was in 1995. I mean, it took that long for me to even have an awareness of it, but I was lucky, because there have been a lot of women who took a chance on me to be a coach. And it just happens that a lot of them have been gay, and that's it. So, you know, my hope is that being on this panel, that I can bring that forward, that there are people who are heterosexual who want everybody in the boathouse. So.
Yeah, I have a lesbian coaching mafia that has looked out for me for 30 years too. And those women, athletic directors, former football, softball coaches who have moved in to be that first generation of women in sport have done a huge amount, and they're not present anymore in sport nearly as much as we're seeing. Linda Muri, how about your 80s experience?
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. So I am a straight friend of everybody on this group, and anyone who's listening, doesn't matter. I went to high school in the late 70s. I graduated in 1981. I was part of the first wave of women and girls who benefited from Title IX. And even then it was a pretty rough road to hoe with battling men and boys who didn't want girls and women taking their spots. And that kind of continues. At the same time, just relating it to our conversation tonight, when I was in high school, it really wasn't feasible, wasn't possible, wasn't safe for my classmates who were gay and lesbians to be out. Just that it just couldn't happen. And it's so impressive how much has changed. We still have a ways to go, but when I think about the high school kids that I worked with in the late 90s when I was student teaching, and how their LGBTQ organizations set up and support for those kids, and so it's that was in like less than 20 years, and so things can change, and we need to make things change very quickly. But touching on my coaching career, I started collegiate coaching and fell into a position coaching lightweight men. Sometimes it was a great thing, but we've got the Nick is laughing because I was a lightweight rower, and I think of we've got men, women, and lightweights. The lightweights tend to be the third gender, is a little bit of a rowing joke, maybe only among lightweights. So I'm taking a risk here. But I coached lightweight men for Division I lightweight men's rowing for 16 years, and it was pretty remarkable to have that opportunity. And much of my career, I have to thank Harry Parker and Charlie Butt for taking a chance on me, because it just wasn't done. And I was the first woman to coach in the lightweight Division I league as an assistant coach. And Chris Wilson was the other woman who had coached before me, and she had coached heavyweight men. And at that point, through the late 90s and into the early 2000 teens, I was the only woman coaching at the Division I level. And it's remarkable because most the higher you get up in the rowing level, the more there is at stake, and this is true in almost any field, the less opportunity there is for women. And so it's very common to have, at this point, a high school coach could be a woman. That no one looks at that kind of oddly, because it's low stakes. But as you get higher up into collegiate coaching at Division I, even Division III, you move on to the national stage, it becomes increasingly difficult because of the glass ceiling. And anyway, what I wanted to say is that a lot of what I do to create a welcoming boathouse and a welcoming team is tapping into some of to quote Kevin, some of the outsider I've experienced, and use that to help me be a better coach and a better person, and make my team a place that's welcoming for everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, Linda. So I'm going to be the fourth in this. I rowed at Princeton from 1982 to 1986. I was a swimmer in high school. I was told fairly early about when women first started rowing at Princeton, they were allowed into the bay to pick up their boat and walk out. And that was it. They were not allowed upstairs. They were not provided locker facilities. You certainly, if you don't know it, you should also look up the story of the Red Rose crew at Yale and all the things that they had to do in the first Title IX demonstration. And so it's a privilege coaching women now with a $7.5 million boathouse at Kansas, which is gorgeous. It's one of the nicest facilities in the country. To think that has gone, Kevin's been there, to think that facility was built exclusively basically for women at the college level. So we've come a long way, but it sort of comes, comes around. So when I rowed at Princeton for 4 years and we won the IRA my junior year, and I lost 6 races the entire college career, 4 of them to Harvard, Linda, but that's okay. I never felt that entire time like I was welcome in rowing. I always felt I was an imposter. I always felt someone was gonna find out. I didn't have a good erg, and that's why I would be 2nd or 3rd or 4th on the ranking list going into, say, 600 meters, or we did a 6-minute test, so 4 minutes to go, 4 minutes in, I'd be right up there with Olympians, and I would crack every single time. There was something about not feeling welcome that just would hit me at that point. And that leads to further exclusion because people don't really trust you. And yet I get on the water and they'd say, oh, he never loses a race. And it was rare that I lost a race, right? So I didn't feel at home in athletics until I returned home to Washington, D.C. the summer after I graduated in 1986. And I joined a gay master swim team. I was back in the pool. I was playing water polo, things I had done. And I was surrounded by a bunch of gay men. And the very first practice we went to, so I was young. I was much skinnier than I was now. I had shoulders. I was like the college athlete who would come in. And so lots of people were looking at me, and it was okay that they looked at me. And even more importantly, it was okay that I looked back, right? And this, for me, was this profoundly liberating experience that could never have happened inside the Princeton Boathouse, although I did a lot of looking inside the Princeton Boathouse too, because I might have been in the closet, but I wasn't dead. The challenge with that is that the summers of 1985, 86, and 87 were also the explosion of AIDS. It was a time when I was meeting people through swimming, and then they'd go away, and then they'd come back 2 months later, and they'd gone from being healthy and athletic to having Kaposi sarcoma on their face, to having shrunk 90 pounds from 200 to just barely over 100, and they were dying. And by the time I was 25, I buried 70 friends. And that is directly what led to me refusing to be in the closet as I was also becoming a coach. I coached for 3 years in prep schools and did well. Then I went to Michigan to start grad school. And while I was in grad school, I started coaching at Michigan, and then Greg Hartsuff, to whom I owe a significant amount of my career opportunities, came there, and he and I started coaching together, and we started getting really, really fast. So fast that eventually they had to kick us out of the IRA because coaches were losing jobs for losing to club coaches, and Rutgers got demoted from varsity status, right? And involved in that response from some of the coaches, there was also this thing about who is this faggot who is beating us, and why is he there? And coaches really not liking my presence there, right? So I'd see Linda and we'd smile. And I, because like I knew that there was like, hey, I got you, right? So I would go looking for jobs, and I would not get interviews. Teams that I had destroyed as a coach, I could not get an interview because I was angry. That was the word. I was angry. I was outspoken. And yes, I was angry. My friends were dying, had been dying. I was beating people and not getting paid. And I just figured this out earlier today. But in a 30-year coaching career, which includes 10 national championships, 3 Olympians, an international gold medal, and actually the only international gold medal in a long time for a men's 8 at international competition at the senior level, at the World University Games, I have been fully employed as a coach for 3 of those 30 years. So that is a real legacy of discrimination. I have to figure out how to retire. That's something I'm looking at, and I don't know how to do that. because for 27 of those years, I was having to do something else and try and coach. So not to be the Debbie Downer on all that, but when folks say, oh, there wasn't really a cost to that, yeah, there's been a cost to being an openly gay man, to being the first openly gay man to be a Division I head coach in any sport ever, as far as we know, in 2000 at Eastern Michigan University, where 2 years later I got fired for standing up for the equality of the women on my team and insisting that they actually spend the money on the women that they were supposed to spend on it. So there are real consequences that folks on this panel have felt, which I think that's why we wanted to start with this. So even as we're getting to, you know, things look great and things are getting better, and we are so excited for this young generation that you're going to hear from about now, please keep in mind that the discrimination is real and that it has had an effect on some of us. So we're going to continue a little bit with some exclusion. Let's go to, interestingly, this is mostly from men. So Craig, why don't you start here?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Charlie. Hey, everybody, welcome. Thanks for joining on a Thursday night. So I've been rowing, well, this would have been my lucky 13th season, but there's been other plans. But I was recruited by who's now my boss, well, in a gay bar, and he says to me, hey, you're tall, do you ever think about rowing? I said, no, but sounds fun. He says, okay, I'll pick you up and on Monday, and I went and I never stopped going. And it was amazing. I knew going in that Chicago Rowing Union was an all-gay team. They started right after, or they started to participate in the Chicago Gay Games when that happened. So going in, I knew that that I could be myself, and I didn't have to be manly. I didn't have to act like a jock. That I can just focus on being me and learning the sport and getting better. So we would travel around locally, but also we would travel to different states to do different regattas. And when word got around that Chicago Rowing Union crew was a gay team, we would hear things, right? There would be like, oh, there's the gay boat, they're the fags. And you'd have to shrug it off because, I mean, really, what can you do? Yeah, you can yell back, but I mean, you're kind of in the minority. And even as early as last year, I was in a boat. One of my friends from Chicago was cheering us on, and we were coming into the dock, and he heard someone from some rando team say, oh, look at those faggots. So it still happens. It's mostly an inclusive sport, but man, that homophobia is still out there, and it's something that we have to deal with, and it hurts.
Thanks, Craig. Lowell, you're now sort of, and this is amazing to say, an openly gay coach at the University of Wisconsin in Randy Jablonek's boathouse. This is just amazing. Like, the world has changed. And yet you still find yourself even in that space which has become more inclusive, which Rebekah is also going to talk about later, having some questions to have to answer, mostly for yourself, it seems, but they still come up in your head. So what's going on there?
Yeah, piggyback off of what Craig shared of just how real homophobia it is. It gets into you, it sinks into you, and we've been conditioned growing up in school that it's something different, it's something extra, it's something you have to deal with, and that can be challenging. I feel really fortunate that my mom, my sisters, my first rowing coach was a lesbian, my first boss was a gay man. Everyone around me was super supportive, and so it wasn't something that I was really worried about growing up, but it just gets in there over and over again. And so when I was applying for this job, it was, should I share this, or should I kind of withhold it a little bit? It was, when we got a new associate AD with our team, do I share this in our first conversation? When we have recruits for official visits, or I'm talking with them over the phone, what happens if I share this about who I am? And when they ask who I am, can I have them over to my apartment for dinner? We like to host recruits to coach's house. How is that going to be perceived? With high school campers, we do camps with 14, 15, 16-year-olds who might not be super aware about this. How are they going to perceive it and take it if this is the first interaction with it? And I think that part of it is, right now, it's still gay is sexual. It's very sex-based. It's very masculine versus feminine versus just part of who you are. And so that becomes baggage versus just part of the conversation. And that's still in the back of my mind. So even though I knew Coach Clark was open and progressive, I knew the women's staff was open and progressive, I knew my former teammates on both the men's and women's side wrapped me up and didn't care about it. It was in the back of my mind of, what does this mean? And some of that self-censorship and self-monitoring of how do I approach this? And when you're kind of tiptoeing through it, you're fighting with one hand tied behind your back, you're a little bit quieter, and it's hard to be clever, smart, successful, quick if you're holding yourself back. So that was definitely challenging in the first couple of years that I was coaching, and it's gotten a lot easier just doing little things, wearing a Pride t-shirt, wearing a Pride wristwatch, that these types of things have helped me be a lot more comfortable. But it's still there for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Lowell. And this is also sort of something that we'll get to in section 3, but I can still count the number of openly gay Division I head coaches who are male on 2 hands. And not be complete. And there are more assistant coaches, but there are very, very few, just because we're not the expectation is probably the best way of saying it. But one of the things that's been amazing about rowing as a community is that there have been spaces that have opened up. People have been able to make a way in all sorts of places. And lots of times it's actually been incredibly personally welcoming for many of us. The 20 years that I coached at Michigan, those guys have my back the entire way. There was the day that the marriage ruling came out, we were preparing the World University Games team, and 4 of the Michigan guys were on there. And they showed up at practice and just literally put me in this enormous bear hug and started crying and laughing and whatever. And all the other athletes were going, oh, okay, that's cool. And there was another coach who had come to visit, and he got remarkably quiet. And I found out years later that he actually is gay. And it was the first time he had ever seen just athletes be that affirming of their coach. So sort of, if you will, go to the good news of inclusion and ways that we've felt included in rowing, how rowing has been so important to us, and what the community is doing. Charlotte, how do you like to talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I figured out my sexuality pretty late in the game. I was around like 22, I'd say, when I really came to terms with it. I grew up and I even went to college in a very cis, straight environment. Like no one was actively homophobic, but I didn't know any gay people before I went to college. And even on my college team, we only had one lesbian who was out. In all 4 years that I was there, which is strangely, the straightest rowing team in America, probably. But of course, I got stuck there. And then post-grad, I went and started training in Boston with Riverside High Performance. And 6 out of the 8 women there were all lesbians. And it really created this environment where I was allowed to feel comfortable to explore my own sexuality. And it was really, really nice, honestly, because I wasn't just like around straight people talking about straight stuff anymore. Then I had these women who were talking about their queer encounters and how they support each other. And it all like hit so home for me. And having that set of people there to help me really look into myself and support me and be there for me as I was questioning and really struggling to find this all out was beyond helpful and helped me become who I am today. But yeah, the rowing community, at least on the women's side, is very queer. And I would like to just let everyone know that there will always be a space for you here. Even if you are on a straighter team, there are definitely plenty of us out there for you to connect with. There are plenty of gay-only teams across the country. There's one in Chicago that Craig's gonna talk about. So I just want you to know that there's for sure a community here to support you and love you and help you figure out anything you need to, because I personally was very lucky to have that, and I want to expose that for anyone else who might be struggling and need some help. That's me.
Thanks, Charlotte. So Craig, yeah, gay rowing team? No, not possible. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, so as far as I understand it, there are only 2 gay-only or gay rowing teams in the States. I think there's one in London and then one in Australia maybe. But yeah, I happen to be on the 2 here on this continent, Chicago Rowing Union and DC Strokes. And like I said before, going in, I knew that it was an all-gay team, so it was an easy transition. Everyone was really welcoming. It was really fun to be around. And just like getting to travel, you wake up at the crack of dawn and you like pull your ass off with 7 other people all week long from spring until winter. You eat meals with them, you have a beer with them. So they become your family. And most of the people that I've met at CRU, they're still my good friends. Simone is one of them. We talk daily, even though we live in 2 different cities. We're probably closer now than ever. So they become family, and you make the boathouse your second home because you're there all the time. And then I moved to DC just over 3 years ago. And I decided when I moved that, of course, I would join the DC Strokes because it's what I do. I'm good at it. I love doing it. So I joined the team, and it was just an easy transition. The guys here are super. We have women on the team. We have straight people on the team. We had straight coaches. But everyone it was just no big deal. And again, you just show up, you work hard, pull your ass off, and win. And same thing. They're my family, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
So we're reminded from some folks in the chat that there's also the San Francisco Blades. There's a Boston Gay Rowers Club. There are folks out there. So it is actually a place you can go row, and you don't have to be gay to do it, but just a great place. And there's a lot of fun, and the drinks afterwards are always good. So that's there. But Simone, you've had an experience of inclusion in crew in Chicago Rowing Union that actually isn't about your sexual orientation. Can you tell us how how you came to rowing and crew?
Sure. Actually, I was at a street fair in Chicago, and I was approached by this tall, dark, handsome man, and it happened to be Craig Wu, and he asked me if I wanted to learn to row, and I had never heard of really. I mean, I always lived in like North Dakota, Montana, and Idaho, so there wasn't a lot of opportunity for a lesbian woman to be rowing in that environment. And also probably cost was prohibitive. My father was a bricklayer. And so Craig got me involved in that. And I'll give you a real quick example of being included in on a team. By the time I learned to row in a more consistent way, there wasn't as many women on our team. And so I ended up rowing with the early morning men's team. And I never ever heard anything from them about not pulling hard enough or not contributing. All I ever heard from them was all I had to do was pull my own weight and just a little bit more. And so that always made me feel really welcome. But the thing that really sealed my love for my teammates was I was driving to practice one morning, and some guy cut me off, and he was driving a Beamer, and he had this horrendous road rage at me, and he was screaming all these really terrible words. And I have a 5th degree black belt, so it wasn't like I was physically intimidated, but you get it kind of gets in your head, and you want to engage, but you know that's just going to make it worse. So I just kept driving, but I was shaken. And when I walked up to my 7 guys and my cox to talk about what had just happened, I was just gathered up in this warm ball of hugs, and all these guys were saying these loving things to me, and they were so concerned about what was happening. And that to me was like being with a supportive group, and you know, being able to sit around in love. And I've always appreciated that. And I still, like Craig, I still keep in touch with all those guys that I used to row with. And we still socialize. And I don't think I've ever met a group of people, and I've competed a lot in my life, but I've never met a group of people that love you and accept you in the way that I did when I was rowing with Chicago Rowing Union. So that was fun. And I know that if you're lonely, or if you want to meet people, or if you just want to have fun, that was the place to go. And I certainly found a passion at my age, after my competitiveness for elite athletes has changed a little. I'm able to now enjoy a whole different sport and learn something completely new, and I love every minute of it. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Simone. Mac, tell us about Ithaca College.
All right, so this part of my story is mostly related to me being a gay woman, because that's what I've had the most experience with. And I'm from Montana also. And so my sexuality is really colored pretty much my whole life experience, because my first step was picking a college that I knew was queer friendly, because there was no way that I was going to go somewhere that was stifling to who I was as a person. And so I found Ithaca College, and I decided that I was going to walk on. And I had no idea what I was getting into. I definitely didn't know the inclusivity of the team, or even really what rowing was. And I have to say that I think being respected as a person for all of your facets and all of your identities is a human right, but it's been a real privilege to be on this team, on the women's team. It definitely helped that the campus is queer. So by default, there's going to be more resources and probably a higher population just by default on all the sports teams. But when I came to the boathouse and started to see who was around me and realized that people were having conversations about their same-sex significant others, things like that, that it was, okay to talk about, and not just okay, like you could be gay as long as you didn't talk about it or didn't act on it or didn't make it a thing. It was like, it was okay. And so honestly, I've been aggressively out and maybe over the top, but there was other colleges that I wanted to go to that I couldn't go to. There were sports teams that I've been on that I didn't enjoy being on because of that sort of deal. And so I was looking around and I was seeing queer people in positions of power. I was seeing queer captains. Me and my friends a couple of times every other year, kind of a deal, we would look at rosters and go, oh my gosh, we're looking at half the team or more. Never seen as a bad thing. And honestly, I haven't seen a lot of conflict. I mean, not only am I comfortable wearing this shirt to practice, if I picked one of my straight friends and they needed, some clothes for practice, I'd hand them my shirt as well, and they'd take it, they'd wear it. I mean, if I wanted to hang a gay pride flag in the boathouse, I'm sure we'd get one the same day. So I think it's been a real privilege to never be in the middle of an erg piece or race and say, wow, are my teammates pulling hard for me? Are we going slower because they don't want a gay person in their boat? I've never thought that a day in my life. And honestly, I've made a lot of great connections through rowing. I've won races with gay women from other teams in the same boat, just like mixed boats at the head of the fish. That was a wonderful experience. So I definitely want to thank all the people who came before me. You don't get a gay friendly culture without people being out and people taking that first step. And I'm proud to be a person who continues that culture.
That's awesome, Mac. Thanks. And noting in the chat that Christopher King says that having had a very different experience in the boathouse next door at Cornell, granted between 2001 and 2005. But so there's a question of, so does it mean less because it's Division III? Is it easier or not? And so Rebekah, you're in like Division I, one of the big boathouses, and you've seen some shifts at Madison, which granted, very gay friendly town for a long time. I mean, if you're gay in Wisconsin, like there's Madison and there's, one other place pretty much. So, so what's it been like since from your freshman year to where you are now, having just finished your eligibility?
Yeah, so it's been a really great experience, I would say. So I actually didn't come out until I was 21, which was last year. And I didn't, I guess, never ever feel the need to have to come out because by my senior year, like it was normal to be in the locker room talking about girls and, like it didn't, no one felt uncomfortable being able to talk about, the other side of our lives. But my freshman year, I remember hearing that like, oh, there might be 2 girls on the team who are dating or doing whatever, but no one really talked about it. No one really acknowledged it. And the girls themselves didn't really acknowledge it. And I think by not talking about it, you silence so many and you silence their stories. And I have heard, now that I think there were women just like them, where we didn't talk about it, but you kind of had a feeling that something was going on. And this is an issue that's also discussed by POC rowers, that when we don't acknowledge other identities and experiences, we often suppress others and make individuals feel uncomfortable, especially in a space that's supposed to be supportive and a place that we're a lot of times supposed to be very vulnerable with one another. And, by my senior year, like we have 2 relationships on our team. We've had relationships on our lightweight women's team. Like my girlfriend is on the track team. which is a totally different experience for her as well, because, you know, on her team, they don't talk about it. I don't think anyone even knew we were dating until like 6 months later, you know, like it just isn't something that's talked about. And I feel very fortunate that like I didn't even feel like I had to come out, because, you know, I felt comfortable bringing it up when I was, you know, a sophomore and junior in college, and that there were other women who were kind of making that, you know, their mission to. The like first thing I think you need to do is just talk about it, you know, get it out in the open, like feel comfortable being able to voice all parts of who you are, and being fluid about who, you know, who you want to be with, who you want to be as a person. Because again, like how can you expect an athlete and a person just to be the best person, student, and performer that they can be when they don't feel safe where they are, they don't feel heard.
Thanks, Rebekah. Walking into boathouses can sometimes completely transform people's lives. That's one of the things that we talk about. That's one of the things that we sell when we're recruiting walk-ons, right? Come in, it'll change your life. But Nick Lee Parker has quite a story about transformation, which we're bringing up because it also talks about the power of a coach to create that transformation. And so as Rebekah's talking about changes that happened in there, and surely athletes are empowered to do that, there are also things that coaches can do that change people's lives. So Nick, you want to tell us about Pete Steenstra?
Yeah, I will. But I'm going to start with Rebekah and Lowell. My first person ever hired me for a full-time coaching job, Wisconsin grad. And thank you, Scott Alwyn. That was a big risk, and it's meant a lot. I grew up in Missouri. It was a pretty conservative place. And so when I got to the boathouse at Ohio State, I decided I was going to walk on, and we're down there, and there's 100 people in this walk-on meeting. And the head coach gets up there, Peter Steenstra. And if you guys have seen Peter, Peter's a big man, right? Peter is confident. Like he epitomizes like this big, strong, masculine man. And he says, you know, I don't care if you're a woman, a man, black, white, gay, or straight, we're here to make boats go fast. And that was it. And for me, that was the first time I ever felt really safe. I knew I had this person in the room, the leader of our group, who had said, this is what we're about, this is what we're doing. And really critically, he followed up on it. How we led the team for the next 4 years. I mean, that was one statement, but then there was a culture of, if you're going to do the work and you're going to commit to making the team fast, you are welcome here. And that's actually, I think, one of the real positives of being a club team. We didn't have a roster cap, right? So everybody who wanted to do the work and be part of the team and make boats go fast, you could be there. Like you had an open invitation. And I thought that was really important. And that's something I think that all coaches, you have an opportunity to do. And it's not just saying it and not being out there, but it's really following through and making sure that your culture's built around it. And it has a lasting impact, not just on the queer individuals, but on everybody. And I know I have a lot of conversations with my classmates that we've all grown from our experiences we had, and we continue to do so. I hope that's something that all the allies listening realize that's part of one of the things you can do, and we're going to keep making it better.
Thanks, Nick. So we're going to move now into our next round, which is about gender identity and gender issues in US rowing. And Chris Chase is actually going to put up in the chat a link to the, or he may already have, I think, but put it up again just because you never know, to the US rowing policy on gender. It's very clearly not a transgender policy. It is a policy because every single one of us comes to rowing with gender, and that yet we come into a rowing that structurally is bifurcated. It's male and female, and not everyone fits into those two sluices, right? So when we were asked to put together that policy a few years ago, it was very hard to find openly trans people in rowing. And you'll notice that the trans folks that we have on this panel are pretty young. So they were competing maybe, or Mac was in maybe just barely in high school, right? But so we reached out to other sports, and we reached out to try and get the best thing we can. And here, just sort of everyone knows that it's there. Here are some real basic points about that policy that we think it's important for folks to know. Number one, in any US rowing regatta or program, right, you declare your gender. So you sign up, and you have to sign up with one or two. We apologize to folks for whom that doesn't fit well, that is what it is, but you get to do that, and you get to make that choice. It is not dependent on what your ID says. It's not dependent on what your birth certificate says. It's not dependent on what your legal name may or may not be. You do not have to have started any form of transition, social, medical, whatever. You come and you register where you are, okay? So that's number one. It's about self-identity. Got to point out, this does not apply to the NC2A. It does not apply to international rowing, where there are other standards that have to be met. But if you're in a US rowing space, that's the way it works. The other thing that's really important that we got from the parent of a young trans boy who's a really good friend of mine, and at 12, he just started his testosterone last week, so he really is doing it. There are young people who are growing up trans. There are young people who are, it's not necessarily something, some folks figured out later. This young man who I love so deeply told his parents at 2, and they were smart enough to listen. So this young man has grown up. He's a very good gymnast, and it's been fascinating to watch him being taught literally in his sport to walk through the world as a boy, right? Because men's gymnastics, rowing, you get in the boat, it's rowing. Gymnastics, it's two essentially very different sports. But his mom said that her biggest fear was that he would show up at a meet sometime and be challenged as he was trying to walk onto the mat to start his routine. And so included in the US rowing policy, it is very, very clearly stated that there is no on-site challenge to anyone's participation on gender. If you're lined up to be in that boat, you go in that boat. The referees are supposed to be trained, and we hope that they are being trained to know that that's the way in. And if there is a challenge process, but it happens back in Princeton. It happens after the racing. And there has been, as I'm sure trans folks on this call can tell even more than I do, but there's been a significantly sort of, case that's hit the news from Connecticut from two sprinters. Both of them African-American, both of them from urban spaces, who they're good sprinters. One of them has won state championship in the girls' side. They're trans women, trans girls, and there are some white parents from fairly affluent neighborhood who have been very upset that their daughters have somehow been disenfranchised from opportunity because of the presence of these two girls. I will point out that one of the young cisgendered women who had been opposed to that actually trained harder and beat one of the two trans girls this year. So actually spurred, excellence, which is good. And having talked to a lot of track coaches about this, I said, so would it make a difference in these young other women's ability to get recruited? And no, we recruit off the watch. We recruit off of times. We recruit off of what person you are. So the only way it's going to hurt that young woman who's making an issue about it is that she's labeled herself as not a good teammate. She's labeled herself as someone who you probably wouldn't want to bring on your team. So in that way, it's hurting her, but her own speed is her own speed. So we're going to talk a little bit about trans stuff, and if I've misspoken on any of that, folks will correct me, and I will we'll glad that. By the way, if you make a mistake and someone corrects you, you just say, thank you, and I'm sorry, and you move forward. That's the way we're going to do it here, and it's a good thing to think. But we do want to start a little bit with talking about gender. And we want to talk about gender because there's some interesting differences that Charlotte is going to talk to us about, a dichotomy in acceptance of queer women versus gay men in rowing, and some thoughts she has on that. So Charlotte, let's go away.
All right.
Go away with it.
Yeah, I'd love to. All right. Yeah, so I'm going to just speak a little bit to how there really is no safe space, as far as I've seen, outside of a very few queer rowing clubs for queer men in rowing. I was very lucky to have an incredibly supportive and welcoming group as a lesbian, but unfortunately what I've seen on the side of gay men is it is really, really tough to be gay and an athlete, let alone gay and a rower. There are some very strong stigmas and stereotypes that surround queer people, especially queer athletes, as far as, you know, butchy women are stronger, obviously, and like gay men must be weak and feminine. And that sort of works out in the favor for lesbians. I mean, it's definitely problematic, but like nowhere near as problematic as the stereotypes surrounding gay men. And this really comes to a head with toxic masculinity. And unfortunately, I have experienced quite a lot of that in men's rowing. It sort of just takes one athlete to come in and lead the group to create a really unfortunate culture on a men's team. And yeah, so sorry, I have to check my notes. Yeah, so, but this toxic masculinity like really affects both men and women's teams. So it affects the women, obviously, because it conflates femininity with weakness. And so as a woman, you're told that you're not as strong, you're not as good, you don't belong here because you're feminine. And if that translates over to gay men and they're telling them the same thing, it makes it a really, really uncomfortable position for these gay men, for them to be on this team full of real men who aren't as feminine presenting necessarily. It's a really hard spot for gay men to be in. And so typically they just stay in the closet. If they're, you know, straight presenting, and they can get away with it. And if they aren't, they're bullied and they eventually leave the team. And that's obviously a huge problem. So I just think that it's really interesting, and we really have to make a push to create some more spaces and acceptance for queer men in rowing, because we're getting there with the women. You know, we all have a very strong support system here, fortunately, but that is not there for the men at all. And it affects not only gay men, but also women who are trying to row. And having that attitude in a boathouse and on a team is going to make your team slower, period. If you don't allow everyone to be their own self and be fully who they are and express themselves how they want to, they are not going to be able to go out and pull as hard as they can. They're not going to feel comfortable pulling as hard as they can for other people on the boat either. So you're really shooting yourself in the foot by not creating a comfortable space for everyone in the team. So what I would say as allies, what you all could do and what we all should be doing is making a very strong statement, much like Nick has been making, that this is an inclusive spot and we do not stand for anything else. And on top of that, backing it up, listening to the minorities that come to you and the marginalized people who bring up issues that have happened on your team, you have to listen to them and follow through with them and make sure that you pay attention to this issue, you nip it in the bud, you talk to the people who have been creating issues, and if they have to go, they have to go, because that one fast person who's creating a toxic culture is not worth it, because it's making the rest of your team slower. So that's my thoughts and feelings on the matter. I love that queer women have so much support here, but there's a huge lack of support for queer men, and it is harming the sport. to be fair. So that's all.
Thanks, Charlotte. And I will say that one of the reasons that the University of Michigan men outperformed so many people, and we really outperformed most of men's collegiate rowing for a long time, is that we work on issues of just acceptance of masculinities, various stuff. It doesn't mean that there aren't guys. It doesn't mean that there aren't dick jokes and all that sort of stuff, right? But it's not allowed to be toxic. And as much as anything, because we have women on our team who are coxswains and they're a part of our team, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen. So in the places that it did come up, again, Greg would stand up and say something, I would say something, and eventually it got to the point where the guys would say it, right? We didn't even have to. And so it is possible not to have a toxically masculine boathouse, but it does definitely take some stuff that comes up there. So we're going to shift right now, and actually we have some folks who are trans and rowing and have a rowing background. And so a lot of folks haven't had a chance to hear trans people talk about being trans within the concept of rowing. So we're excited to sort of
Charlie,
you're on mute. Charlie, you're still on mute.
I'm still muted, I'm sorry. All of that goes to say, we have trans people here. And so we are going to hear from some folks, and ask me what I said about Michigan men and building a non-toxic culture in another time. So Liam, talk to us about starting to figure out being trans while you're rowing on a women's rowing team.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Charlie. And thank you to everyone for sharing your stories so far. I know it's hard to do. I want to talk a little bit about, I think, the uncertainty that trans folks face, if not hostility in sports, right? I work on building trans inclusion policies in athletics, and I have a Google alert set up for transgender and athlete and sports, and it hits my inbox every morning. I don't suggest anybody set up that Google alert for themselves. And this is how my voice sounds, but I don't mean to say that as a joke, right? The discourse and dehumanization of trans people and trans bodies is literally fatal, right? And it contributes in no small part to the staggering rate of violence that trans folks and non-binary folks experience, particularly directed at Black trans women. But to talk a little bit about my experience in rowing, I started rowing when I was a kid in upstate New York because I learned there was a sport that you could play while sitting down. I was really misled. I thought it would be easy, but I stuck with it so far, and it kind of landed me at Duke, and I rowed at Duke on the women's team from 2012 to 2016. I do want to preface this by saying I loved being an athlete at Duke, right? I loved my coaches, I loved my team, I loved the environment we were able to cultivate, but I never felt that I could come out as a trans man, right? When I first started at Duke in my earlier years on the team, I realized I was bisexual, I realized I was queer, I realized my sexual orientation was not what I thought it was. And when I realized that, I felt really empowered to work with some of my teammates and some of my peers and administrators to start a student group specifically working on LGBTQ inclusion in the athletic department. And that group's done a ton of great work and still is doing great work to this day. But when I realized I was trans towards the end of my time at Duke, I couldn't bring myself really to do the same, right? I felt sort of too scared about what it might cost me. I felt, I was the team captain, was our first year with an entirely new coaching staff. We were working super hard. There was a lot of what ifs and uncertainty up in the air, and I just didn't know how it would land, right? I didn't know if I'd be able to continue playing. I didn't know if I would lose funding. I didn't even know if every member of my team would still respect me and look up to me as their captain. And that kind of uncertainty, it didn't make sense to me, right? It didn't make sense given the support I had around me. Lots of folks have been really, really inclusive before around LGBTQ inclusion, around other conversations about social justice, and been really supportive of initiatives. There's lots of great advocacy work happening on campus. It's not like anyone ever was explicitly, we're not going to have trans people on our team. And to this day, some of my biggest supporters are my coaches and my teammates from when I was in college. But at the time, I had no clue, right? And I think it's a great lesson that just being not explicitly discriminatory doesn't make a program inclusive, right? There has to be a really proactive and clear commitment. So during my time at Duke, I never really came out as trans, and I carried that with me as an athlete the whole time. And I know I wasn't my best because of it. I know I could have been a better leader and a better athlete had I shared that and had I got to show up to practice every day authentically. And I think that's the truth for so many LGBTQ students and athletes and rowers. And even if there are boatloads of support, if it's not proactively communicated, it can get interpreted as fear and uncertainty in our minds and kind of jump to the worst case scenario. And I recognize that I'm still, even talking about this, I was still navigating that with a ton of privilege, especially even as a binary trans person. And I still to this day, I've never touched an oar as a men's rower because it's so hard to feel it out with the programs. And so I think that's why it's so important to be proactive with the work. And I'm really heartened to hear about USRowing addressing policies proactively and having an eagerness to communicate that, because I think it's a big piece of it. And so to all the allies who are wondering about what you can do, it's, you know, don't wait until you have a trans athlete, till you have a non-binary athlete. You really have to get in front of inclusion and be really clear and proactive about it, and not be passive in your allyship. And, you know, now that I'm further away from it, I never rowed as a out trans athlete. So I think it's really important to hear from some other folks on the call who have had to navigate rowing while actively, you know, sharing their gender identity and moving through those spaces. So I'll kick it back to Charley.
So Liam, getting that single, start training. We may only be able to race singles this fall. So, you know, get out there and remember, however you present with your USRowing membership is who you get to be and whatever that is. And
oh yeah,
I told
you I'm on the air all the time.
You're actually in sort of some of this process, thinking through what your gender means for you and means for you as a rower. And where are you with that at Ithaca right now?
So as far as a timeline goes, I'd say the most I've ever struggled with realizing my identity and all that sort of business was probably late spring, early fall of this year. And I have to say that was probably one of the most psychologically low points in my life. And I think until I figure out really what I want, I'm stuck in a very vulnerable position. I think that the gender aspect of who you are as a person is a much scarier thing to come to terms with, just because of I think that transgender rights are sort of behind, you know, sexuality rights, and especially in sports, because there's so much controversy around that kind of thing. I know just from my area of the country, the laws that are being passed in Idaho are absolutely horrible. And so where I'm at is that, honestly, I'm not really sure. What drove all of this was, I think I had gotten away with a lot as just being a very masculine lesbian. And those two things really, when it comes down to it, aren't the same at all. But there is a lot of overlap until you start paying attention to some of the things that are happening with yourself. I got hit with sort of massive waves of dysphoria, where you feel like your body is not sort of in alignment with the way you're feeling. And I was lucky enough to also know people who were going through, you know, some of the same things. But those sorts of realizations, if you choose to listen to them, or if you choose to like bury them deep down and never think about them ever again, it really turns your life sort of upside down. And I know every queer person like on this call who's ever had to think about coming out, doing it twice is not something that you ever want to have to deal with. And that's kind of still on my plate in a lot of avenues. I'm talking pretty loud, kind of hoping that the people in my house aren't really listening, because I haven't had that conversation with them yet. And so I think that it's very important to understand that when people come to college, especially if it's a liberal college, that might be the first time that people become aware of these kinds of issues, and as a result might realize things about themselves. And that can be a really dangerous and hard time in somebody's life. So I think it's important not only to sort of make a space to allow people to explore their gender, but it's also important to have resources, to respect people who are taking the time to figure things out, because I don't think it's something that should be taken lightly. You should absolutely respect people when they come to a decision, but it's also important not to force a decision on people when it's such a heavy topic, and it's so personal. So I think, you know, in terms of gender and struggling with your gender, I mean, I hate the fact that it is a struggle. Figuring out yourself when you're so miserable can really be a struggle, you know, whether or not you have support. But every person that you have that an athlete can talk to or confide in, I picture it as kind of a string in a web that kind of keeps you around. You know, suicide among transgender youth, but just transgender people in general, is a huge issue. And it's important to, you know, have that sort of space, have resources. And if you're not aware as a coach or an athlete with those kinds of issues, I think it would be very good to begin to educate yourself.
Thanks, Mac. And I just want to publicly be clear that how brave you are to be sharing this and thinking this through so publicly, and being able to share that with us. And I want to thank you for taking the step that you're taking tonight. I think it's really important to acknowledge that we have to take these steps. So Rafi, you are a trans person, also actually working on trans issues, among other things, in rowing at CRI. So can you maybe combine Liam and Mac and tell us some stuff from your own space?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you, Liam and Mac, for speaking to your stories. I resonate very strongly with both of your experiences. To give people on this little bit of background on my personal journey around gender and navigating a very binary sport as a non-binary person. I rowed at Smith College. I had the incredible opportunity of rowing for a coaching staff that was almost entirely queer. I think it's probably one of the only places in the country where that is true. But if any of you guys are on the call right now, that I think had a huge impact on those of us that came out for the first time while at Smith. I did not come out as trans or non-binary until a couple years after college. I think part of that was having been an athlete in such a binary sport, and having identified so strongly for so many years as an NCAA female athlete. I experienced a lot of self-imposed transphobia, and I think this is a very common theme for a lot of trans people and trans athletes in particular. To tell you a little bit more about myself, so I mentioned in my intro, I'm queer, I'm trans, and I'm non-binary. I know these might be really unfamiliar terms for some people, so I'll break them down for you really quickly. For me, being queer is about who I love. My attraction to people has nothing to do with them being the opposite gender of me, using air quotes here, or being of the quote unquote same gender as me. I am transgender. For me, that has to do with how I relate to my body, and being born in a physical shell that does not reflect who I am and who I know I am. And I am non-binary, which means I do not identify as either gender. I am sometimes both, sometimes neither, usually just somewhere in between. So as someone who is all these things and is currently beginning to medically transition while working in the rowing world, I see a lot of different ways that gender impacts my own experience with the sport and others. So quick thought experiment, especially for coaches who are watching this, but also for any athletes. Imagine you show up at the boathouse every day, and to be able to get to practice, to be able to get on the water with your team. Well, actually, perfect analogy. We all have to wear unis when we race, right? A lot of us hate them. Some of us love them. Regardless of your feelings on them, if they're positive, if they're negative, you are showing up to do something in a very tight outer skin that does not necessarily reflect and feel like who you are. So now imagine you're doing that not just on race day, but you're doing it every day that you come to the boathouse, and you're doing it every day to participate in something that you love and you deeply care about. That's kind of what rowing as a trans person feels like, right? Like you have to put on the skin to row on a binary team. Either it's the opposite gender of what you identify as or a gender that you just do not resonate with. And imagine then as a coach or even as an athlete, you know, what your athletes are going through mentally every time they sit down on an erg or they get in the boat, right? To what Charley said at the beginning about how he would have this this mental break around 4 to 5 minutes into a 6-minute test. Imagine what that's like if you're in practice and everyone around you is, you know, say you're rowing on a women's team, everyone is calling you ladies, everyone's calling you a lady, and you're like, in your head, you're like, but that's not me, who are they talking to? And now imagine how strong and how fast these athletes of yours are already because they're going through this just to show up and put their hands on an oar, how strong and how fast they could be if they didn't have to worry about that. Imagine the drop in their 2K splits. Imagine how much harder they could pull every stroke of a race. So thinking about that, we talk a lot at CRI about, you know, our slogan is rowing for all, right? What does that mean? That means anyone who wants to row should be able to row, right? But how do we put that into practice when it comes to gender and inclusivity? And I think no one really has the answer on this one other than, like, you know, obviously we want to be inclusive. And I will talk to you guys later in, I believe, our round number 4 on the inclusivity checklist about some really concrete things, but just to like start percolating that thought process. I want to reference back to something Denise Aquino said in last week's Black Coaches Roundtable as a moderator. Nothing gets left at the dock, you know, like we tell our athletes to shove off the dock and leave it on land, right? But like, you can't do that if to be in the boat, you have to be in a physical form that is just not who you know you are. So I guess, you know, as coaches, as parents, as teammates, as athletes navigating a world where we are beginning to discuss this more, I think the statistic these days is around 2% of high school age students identify as transgender, and those are just the ones that are, you know, out and saying they are. That does not include the ones who are questioning or who don't feel safe to be out. Imagine how much faster our sport could be if all of these athletes felt at home in their bodies.
Thanks, Rafi. We have a question in the chat from David Schertzer, which sort of comes up to this, and I'm gonna say this question and take it a little bit further, ideally, maybe. So he says that, or David says, don't know what David's pronouns are, but David says, while USRowing's policy allows people to self-identify, it forces them to self-identify into one of 2 categories. In other words, it's binary, right? And David says that they use they, them pronouns. So what can be done to better support intersex and non-binary rowers who want to compete but are forced to effectively lie on registration forms to compete? And what I would ask Rafi, Liam, what would you want to see? Like, what would be the most inclusive way that you could register for a regatta?
I could jump in, Rafi. I don't know if you want to jump in or you want me to go first. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's hard. I acknowledge the challenge of navigating in sports, which is such an inherently binary space, right? It's very, very hard to push up against those categories. That being said, I think there's lots of things that can be done, right? I think self-identification has to be the top way that we do it, right? Allowing folks to identify their gender as whatever it is on that day that they're filling out the forms. And I think, you know, something that I always think about rowing is that we're in a good spot because we're a sport that I think has a lot of opportunities for mixed gender competition. We have mixed gender teams already. I think really, you know, aside from registration forms and being as inclusive and open with these forms as we possibly can, like, I think it's going to be huge in terms of the inclusion of non-binary, intersex, gender expansive athletes to think about how you almost create competitive, serious opportunities for mixed crews and for mixed boats. And that way you're not just sort of imposing like, these are the men's races, these are the women's races. I think there's an opportunity for our sport to really lead on that, coming from the place where we're at. But I'd be curious to hear Rafi's take on it too.
Rafi, any thoughts?
Yeah, so this is honestly something as a coach that I really struggle with, because I want to see people like myself racing. I want to see us on the water as ourselves, right? And I think it actually comes from a place of how do we frame the greater context around competition, right? Because we can do as much as we want on the the US rowing level, but NCAA and FISA are always going to supersede that. So the change, I think, actually needs to come from organizations like US Rowing, large boat clubs in the world, starting to talk to these governing bodies and asking them for their input. Because I think even if we can create a inclusive 100% like full spectrum of the gender rainbow kind of regatta that is US Rowing funded, that ultimately only really impacts masters rowing on a significant level. Because you'll have youth rowing with state regulations that negate anything US Rowing says, collegiate athletes who have NCAA telling them they have to row in a binary, or elite athletes like the athletes I coach with the paranational team having FISA say, well, you can identify how you want, but you just can't compete with us. So I think it's actually, this is something that needs to begin more from a theoretical perspective than from an actual, like, let's create a race entry where men, women, non-binary people, everyone can compete together. Because if we don't have the underlying groundwork of creating an inclusive mindset, like, that doesn't particularly positively impact and advance the change that is necessary. I know that's like a kind of a non-answer in this context, answering the question of like, what can we do to make people like myself feel more included? But I really do think it comes from a place of just changing how we think.
Thanks, Rafi. And we have a comment from Luke Lapointe in the chat, and Luke is the first or one of the first coaches to transition while coaching. And Luke says, I believe sex gender markers in Sweden include a third option, X or O, I can't remember. It appears, what if it were to appear per US Rowing protocol, those folks should be able to row in whatever boat they choose to. So there is a sort of suggestion from folks in the trans community that also, what if you just got rid of gender? What if you just rowed? So this is a time for us to stretch our minds about what that might or might not mean. And there are also surely women who are feeling that, they want to protect women's rowing and women's athletic experience. So it's a difficult conversation to have. Perhaps it'll be something that we can ask Chris Chase to bring back up for a deeper discussion later than the time that we have to give it right now. So we're going to move on in some ways to an idea of a checklist and what can we do from here. But there was a really great conception, which we've been hearing some of here, that came from last Friday from the Black Coaches and Rowers Forum. And that is the idea of what does it mean to be at home? What does it mean to be at home in your skin? What does it mean to be at home in your program? What does it mean to be at home in your boathouse? And this is, in some ways, taking the idea of inclusion further, because if what we're doing when we say we're going to include is that all of us white guys say, well, you can come in and be in our house, but we still structure the house, right? It's not, is what we're trying to do be inclusion, or is what we're trying to do build a home together? And those are some different possibilities maybe as we talk about inclusion. What's the basic assumption and standard of the center of that, right? And we're hearing folks saying, let's think about that some different ways. So Kevin, can you tell us a little bit about your reactions to that discussion that happened on Friday and this idea of home?
Sure. I mean, I think the overwhelming reaction from the coaches on that call is what I hope the overwhelming reaction is to this call, which is, it was just nice to look on a screen and see people who are like me, you know, and people that want me to be a part of the community. And, you know, one of the things that we all, and I use that very inclusively, that we all struggle with is the fact that our sport has been based in privilege. It literally comes from privilege, at least the way that it's been manifested in the United States and, well, in Great Britain as well. But, you know, one thing that we are all going to have to fight in order to find home is the fact that the norm isn't the norm anymore, right? It can't, you know, we talked in our pre-meeting about whiteness and the fact that the sport of rowing very much has been based on being a white male for almost the entirety of rowing history in the United States. I mean, we didn't even have women rowing in the Olympics until 1976, which is within my lifetime. Women didn't row 2,000 meters, correct me if I'm wrong, Holly, until after you won in '84, right? So like the idea that somehow we're going to be able to create a home for everyone has to be present. It has to be always with all of us as coaches, as rowers, masters, gender, whatever it is, it always has to be there. That the norm is everyone. And, you know, as many of the people on this call have said, basically, we all get better when that happens. And there's no doubt about that. I'm sure that everyone here has had an experience where if you weren't in that boat, you know, Nick, if you weren't coaching that crew at Columbia, they're not going that fast. So if you're excluded, then that's a whole experience for a whole lot of guys that doesn't exist. So I think all of these forums actually are saying a lot of the same things. And it's great that we can finally expand our universe within US Rowing to create a better rowing experience for everyone.
Rebekah, would you like to pick up on that a little bit?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, building off of what Coach Harris said, all very true things, you know. These are the same, we're very similar conversations that POC rowers and coaches are having, and it is about intersectionality. I think we have to think about how we can create safe spaces for all different identity and sexuality or sexualities. And it starts with, you know, your teammates, it starts with coaches, and extends to athletic departments and governing bodies to create spaces to amplify queer voices of all different backgrounds, and for spaces for us to come in community with one another, because that's, you know, a huge part of why we row, is to find that family and connection. And at UW-Madison, our athletic department has done a great job, you know, in the past year or two with creating these spaces, creating affinity groups for two groups that I'm a part of, which is Badger Pride, which is very important, and the Minority Student Athlete Union. And within Badger Pride, it's a lot of out athletes, but also we welcome allies, because not everyone, you know, is maybe there in their journey to come out and feel comfortable. And it's just being able to meet queer people throughout, you know, the different sports, because while, you know, my team shows up in huge numbers to these meetings, there are other teams where, you know, you're the only one and you need to find that community, those friends and people to support you. And I think it's, you know, important for us to come together in that sense, because that support may not be readily given in other spaces. And I think, like, as coaches, like, just as coaches need to learn and listen, you know, to their Black and brown rowers, they need to listen to their, you know, queer identifying rowers as well, and recognize, you know, like Rafi said, like, you can't leave things at the door, you know, before you're gonna, you know, sit on the erg to do a 2K, because there's so many parts of our identity that are integral to our experience and growth as people. And it's important for coaches to uplift us and support us in every single aspect, and build that trust, because I know I may not have the same trust in my coaches when it comes to wanting to like talk to them about racial incidents on my team and with other teams in our boathouse. But I at least know of one instance where they stood up for, you know, the gay and bisexual women on our team when, you know, a teammate called another girl a dyke, you know, and was like, that's not accepted. That's not what we do. You will be kicked off the team if you don't understand that the culture of Wisconsin women's rowing is not to tear down others and discriminate. And it's, you know, it's in those instances where you have to listen and take action because, you know, I have to expect that you're going to stand up for me when I'm not around, you know, as a Black bisexual woman. Like, I expect all of my teammates to stand up for me when I'm not around as well. And, you know, one thing that I was just thinking of as, you know, everyone was sharing their stories in one of the recent Rowing in Color podcasts, which, shameless plug, I'm in the newest episode. We talk about, you know, do your white friends like just you, or do they support the whole community? And I think that can be taken into this context as well. You know, like, do your, like, as allies, like, do you like us just because of who we are, or do you like us for who we really are? You know, the entirety of us, do you support our community? And I think, you know, again, as allies, like we need allies of all, you know, like, you know, a gay man to a lesbian woman, you know, from different aspects. Like, we need to think about really, why are we allies? Why are we friends? And why do we want to support those around us? Yeah.
Thanks, Rebekah. So this concept of home is actually important, but as Holly's opening story reminded us, home isn't always a healthy place. Home isn't always a safe place. So yeah, we want to build a home, but we've not also got to think about how that does. And Holly, would you like to tell us about your daughters? I'd love to hear some about them.
All right, don't get me going on those daughters. I love them. Ooh, I have 3 daughters. My oldest, Liza, is here at MIT, which I can't believe. So she'll be 21. And then Ella and Ruby are 14, going on 80. We live in Newton, Mass, which is a very progressive place, thank God. And yet in their middle school, it's been very hard on them, but incredible strength that I've watched them gain. So a lot of friends in their school are trans and really struggling with the bullying, and also with parents of their friends. There was an incident where Ella met the parent, I think the mom of one of her friends, and the parent referred to the friend as she, and Ella knew quite well the friend had a different identity that he went by. And she said that to her mom, well, I know him as he, and that's how I'm gonna refer to them. And she knew there would be a big issue, and it didn't matter. And supporting people in school who are, you know, she sees something happening, she does not shut her mouth. She will go over and physically get between people and support them. Her friends created, they have this money that they put in a locker for their group, very supportive group. And if anyone is having a hard time, they'll go get the cash and go buy a person a latte if that, you know, is what they take care of each other in all ways, absolutely always. And it just makes, it just makes me cry, because it shouldn't, none of this should be. It just, to them, it makes absolutely no sense. And it's so wonderful to see them be powerful and there for everyone.
So, I mean, what we are hearing from Holly, from Rebekah, you know, is that folks stepping in and just interrupting, you know, just interrupting, even if it's gently, even if it's as little as, well, I know that person as he, or, you know, no, we're not going to say the word dyke in our boathouse. You know, this is actually sort of really quite important stuff to do. So we're going to start talking about what are these small things that we actually can do. But I want to go in transition of that to a question that we've had that I think is really important. And it's an anonymous question, right? And so this is for the college coaches here, and particularly, so Lowell, you're a recruiting coordinator. I'm a recruiting coordinator. If you know Nick Lee Parker, he is always recruiting. Coach Harris keeps out recruiting us, finding women from all over the world to come to Tulsa, Oklahoma, etc. So the question is, I'm a rising senior in high school, out with my rowing club and getting ready for several official college visits in a couple of months. Should I disclose my sexual orientation with my prospective teammates and coaches, or hold off until I join the team? And I don't know the gender of this person, so.
I'm happy to dive in first. If you feel comfortable sharing, I'd really encourage you to share. Something that we've all expressed here, I know I've learned from my personal experience, is that you just feel just at ease, you feel more comfortable, you're going to be able to do better if you're comfortable. If you're trying, the entire recruiting process, you're trying to find a school that's the right fit for you. And if that's something that someone hears and they're not going to make you feel welcome on their team, whether it's an athlete or a coach, you probably don't want to be on that team, and you're probably not going to be as successful as you want to be. And you want to find the right school for you, even if that program is really fast. I tell guys all the time, if Wisconsin is not the school for you, I'm going to encourage you to go somewhere else, because we want you to be as good as you can be. And it's not going to be beneficial for either party to have that relationship. But also, we are still not at a point, even though it's really frustrating, where we can just be whatever sexuality, whatever gender identity we are, we still have to talk about it. Charlie's story about him being out, that work is still not done. Unfortunately, we still have to talk about it. And so I'm trying to lead more with that and be more open. And you're still part of that. To this person who's asking the question, that whether we like it or not, we're still pushing and moving that bar forward. And so I encourage you to be courageous in that, if you feel comfortable with it, to share that.
Nick, do you have thoughts?
Same. I think, you always know if you feel comfortable, and if you do, you should let people know. I think that's it's an important part of, exactly right, making sure it's a good fit for you. And if you don't feel comfortable, that doesn't mean that it's not the right spot for you. Sometimes these things take a long time. Sometimes, having that conversation, maybe it means, you're not ready to have that conversation there. So make sure you feel comfortable. And if you are, go for it. And if you're not, it doesn't mean it's automatically a no school for you. Just feel it out, give it some time, and keep an open mind and be honest.
I also think it's important that coaches who are recruiting are being really thoughtful about this. So, Mac, we have a very queer coaching staff at Kansas. Our head coach is a lesbian, married, they just had their first daughter. The third assistant coach is a lesbian. Our graduate assistant is a lesbian. And not that was not planned. It just sort of happened. And so but when we brought a young woman in this last winter in February, we did an early recruiting for the class of 2021. It's the first time we've done it. But one of the things that we say every time we recruit, whether it's an individual discussion, whether it is at an official visit or something like that, we're really clear that if what we have at Kansas is a radically inclusive boathouse. So you get to come and be completely who you're going to be in our boathouse. And then we say things like, no matter where you're from, what languages get spoken in your household, what your politics are or are not, you know, what your sexual orientation is, what your gender identity is. You know, we just go through that, but we include those things in there. And in this particular one, because Carrie was they were weeks away from having a baby when this happened, you know, and so it was sort of like, and me and my wife are gonna have a baby. And I missed it, but one of the young women shot a look back over her shoulder at her dad. So later that day when we were at the basketball game, and let me tell you, the recruiting advantage we have at Kansas, if there's a basketball game, is Kansas basketball. And this dad, in the middle of a great basketball game, just sort of sidles up to me and says, I want you to know how important it was for my child that all got said today. You know, and will that person come to KU? I don't know. I think we have a really good shot because we did the work of showing that person that she could be included in our space and in our time. And if we do get her, she should be in some ways looking at one of 5 other schools, but she's looking at us. So I think that also sort of in the recruiting process, just being explicitly inclusive, like not just, we like everybody here, kumbaya, but like you can do this and you can do that and you can do that and you can do that. And we're going to come together around the training and the work. And that's what's going to make us go. So I think that it's also on us as coaches to be setting that tone in the recruiting process. But I agree completely with Lowell and with Nick. You need to choose a school that, as if you never ever took a stroke, your knee went out, COVID-19 happened, and all of a sudden you were going to go and play field hockey at Bowdoin, which one of the most dear young women in the world to me is going to Bowdoin this fall to play or not play field hockey, right? She still has made a good choice about the school that she's going to be at. So that's where I would start. And I used to wear an earring in my interviews back in those 80s because I knew if they were not hire me because I had an earring in my right ear that I didn't want to work there. So that would be our suggestion, I think, to you all. Some other specific ideas. Linda, what have you done in that same sort of boathouse space to send messages of inclusion?
Sure, and I'm not just speaking to all the straight folks out there. There's plenty of homophobia around and implicit biases that everyone has. So if you are in a position of power to make a change at your boathouse, it's up to you. The burden may be on straight folks like me, but you know, we're in this together. And kind of the biggest thing to do, I think, is being a coach is taking advantage of your position of power and educate yourself is sort of the first order of business. So if you're on this webinar, great. First good step you're taking. Be proactive. Don't wait for something to happen or somebody to walk into the boathouse or think about walking into the boathouse. Make it that way ahead of time. I want fast boats. That's what I want, the fastest people. So it doesn't matter to me, you know, when I'm coaching men, whatever, you know, what color, what I needed lightweight men. So I needed the size, but the rest of it didn't really matter. You know, I had observant Jew, I had to get not a regular Cox box for. I had a Muslim who had to have a place for his prayer rug. You know, whatever it took to get the fastest people in my boat, I was going to do, because it was fast boats, but also because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do, is make our sport inclusive, not exclusive. So things that you can do. Personally, I tapped in a little bit to my feminist tendencies, and, you know, okay, where were times where I was put down? Well, I didn't like that. Why would anybody like being put down because of who they are or what they believe in? So be a role model. Same way that I'm a role model, I try to be fit and enjoy racing and enjoy being on the ergometer for my team. You know, I'm going to walk the walk. And, you know, I would hang posters in the boathouse for, you know, mental health events, because that's another issue that especially young athletes or anyone can struggle with, or violence against women. You know, I would get called out by my superiors for putting these things up, but you got to do it. It's just the right thing. You know, it'd be like stopping a practice, and as Rebekah was saying, not just when she's around, or not just when I'm around. You know, I wasn't going to tolerate any kind of discriminatory language, and that was up front, and I said that. And there's one day we're out for practice, and plenty of times where I had to stop the boat for various things, you know, but passing out spacers for the oar locks or something, and one of the guys in the boat says, well, those are only for fags. Well, that was the end of that practice. You know, I stopped and I call them out. You have to do that. You can't just let it slide. You know, just being silent is being complicit. And if I'm stealing that from the webinar that I heard on Friday night with the Black coaches and athletes, then so be it. But just take advantage of your position of power. You know, you want to engage your team. You want to engage the people at your boathouse. If you have a relationship, a friendly relationship, I'm not talking about, you know, who you're bringing home to meet your parents, but the kind of relationship that you have with your athletes as a coach, you want to get that going. You want to have dialogue, engage them so that they feel like they're in a safe space. You know, I know there's debate about creating a safe space, and then is it really safe? I'm not going to get into that, but I just, in closing, listen to people and hear what they say, and listen to people on this webinar, hear what they say, and your teammates and the people that you're coaching. And anyway, do something. Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Linda. So Lowell, this idea of a checklist sort of worked for you, because you say it's part of how we coach anyway. You want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, we're fortunate as coaches and as athletes that we already know how to do this. You might not know the right answer, but whether it's a checklist, a to-do list, a goal sheet, we do this all the time in our work. And so start there, and we do it with speed goals, we do it with culture, we do it with safety, in our recruiting practices, everything. We have lists and checklists, and it's a way to keep yourself accountable, and just, did I do this or did we not do this? And what do we need to work on, and what's left to work on? So I found that really helpful. Related to recruiting practices, what happens on official visits, what happens in the first day, the first time someone is at the boathouse, the first week, the first year, the continuing education with varsity rowers. It's not easy to keep doing, but if you have it in front of you, it's going to be easier to remember. And the great thing about coaching, and the best coaches I've worked with, that I've talked to, that I've read about, is this stuff is non-negotiable. They don't change what they know makes something fast because someone pushed back. And so you can make this part of your non-negotiable. If you want to be good, this is what you have to do. And if you want to be part of the boathouse, you can get on board. And just to echo what Rebekah said, what Coach Harris said, what Linda said about listening, that's the easiest way to get better from a first step. I love that our offices overlap with the women's offices, because I just hear what they say, what they talk about. It's very different than what we do, and it might be just a different way to present the stroke, to talk about technique, but it makes you think about something different, that it's okay to be not as knowledgeable about something and learn about it and get better about it, that it's definitely a continued process. It's a continuum, not just an automatic more inclusive, check, move on to the next thing.
Thanks, Lowell. So we have two folks on this panel who actually do this professionally, Liam and Rafi. So since you're paid to think about this stuff, what can you tell us just in sort of like what would be on your checklists for inclusion at a boathouse? Liam, why don't you go first?
Sure. Yeah, I can go first. I want to reiterate first what everyone else said about being proactive, you know, recognizing that even if you don't think you do, you have trans and queer athletes on your team. I recently finished about last year crunching some numbers on a survey of about 17,000 LGBTQ youth in the United States. And out of the ones that played sports, over 80% were not out as LGBTQ to their coaches. So about 4 in 5 LGBTQ youth are on teams around the country closeted. So just being like a lot of folks have mentioned, being really thoughtful and being proactive. And there's a million ways to do this. And I do also, what other folks alluded to, want to encourage folks to get out of just trying to tackle LGBTQ inclusion, right? No one is just LGBTQ. We need to think about our races, genders, abilities, faith, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic statuses, right? Everyone has one of those, even if you don't think about it very often. And there's, like I said, like in terms of a checklist, right? We talked a little bit about policies. We've talked about language. A lot of folks have brought out great points about your conduct, right? Setting what is acceptable and what is not acceptable on your team and figuring out how you respond when your team's culture and norms are challenged. Especially when we talk about LGBTQ inclusion, I encourage folks to think about your facilities, to think about your uniforms, to think about your team traditions, right? How that might be holding up gender binaries or heteronormativity. And then also think about how you welcome and greet other teams. And last little, I mean, this is a checklist and we can go on and on. I'm happy to follow up with anyone after this, but the last bit I do want to talk about being a policy person is thinking about travel, right? You know, there is no consistent LGBTQ protections on this country. And so depending on what state you go to, what city you go to, your LGBTQ rowers might not be protected, and people have really differing rights from city to city. You know, and the last thing I do want to say is that, like, it's okay not to have all the answers, right? A lot of folks have said it's been good that you're at this webinar. It's good that you're interested in this. It's good getting started. And I've worked with a lot of coaches who are kind of too nervous to start because they didn't want to do the wrong thing. And I think that kind of doubt is healthy and it's normal. And I think it's a really good opportunity to work with your team and to bring people into the conversation and make sure your entire team or your club or your peers and athletes have ownership over the culture that you're creating on your team, right? So think about the folks who would never imagine joining this webinar and make sure that you bring them into the conversation too, because I think in the same way that rowing is such a team sport, right? Inclusion is also a team sport. I know it's cheesy, but you know, everyone on the team has to buy in and everyone has to be committed to it. And I think doing something is always better than doing nothing. So don't be worried and sit down with the folks around you and figure out how to start moving forward and being proactive with the work.
Thanks, Liam. That's awesome. And Liam works for an organization called the Inclusion Playbook. Is that correct?
Yes.
In North Carolina. So you can find them and find him if you would like some professional level support in figuring out what needs to happen at your club or something like that. And he knows a lot. That is for sure. Rafi, you actually are one of the, you work in a huge, big program that is sort of in some ways transforming what rowing looks like within organizations in the United States. It's not the organizations that Kevin was talking about. I mean, just sort of interesting little point. If you're on a varsity men's rowing, collegiate rowing team in the United States, the likelihood that your program is more than 150 years old is quite high. In other words, even the places where collegiate rowing exists for men at the varsity level, there are obviously things that, but we've come from old institutions. This is where sort of Kevin was starting, and that leaves us with some legacies and some assumptions. But CRI is like this brand whole new thing, including this boathouse and programs and this and that and the other. So as you all have gotten basically to sort of create something from scratch, and I know you haven't been there since the beginning, but what is it that you are doing at CRI and you would say are best practices that other clubs might think about adopting, even if they're 150 years old and downriver in Detroit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like what everyone else, the last couple people have said, is creating that culture shift is critical. You can't create lasting, meaningful change if only, you know, say the people on this webinar are bought in, but the people that would never attend a webinar like this are not. So some concrete actions around that that I have found very supportive actually through my own coming out process at a boathouse like CRI is this goes for, this is more for athletes and people who are queer in some capacity, but finding that group of people that are, you know, your trusted army before you even come out to your whole boathouse is incredibly helpful to so many people. It's what I did when I came out as trans at the boathouse. I went to a specific group of people and said, hey, this is who I am. I'm very anxious about being myself in this space because, you know, it is a very, very large organization, which means we do have a very diverse in opinions group of employees, coaches, members, etc. But can you please be my buffer? So every time someone misgenders me, I don't have to be the one that says, hey, incorrect pronouns, please use they, them, there. And so, you know, for those of you on this call looking for very concrete action items, that I think is the number one thing you can do. You can be that person that sticks up for your LGBTQ members, coworkers, coaches, athletes, etc. Another thing that I've implemented at CRI since I started, at least within the programs that I run, is making sure that from the second people become interested in a program at CRI, they see the inclusivity in terms of a pronouns box on every single intake form they take. This is not CRI wide yet, but it's something we're hoping to roll out for the entire boathouse in the next couple months. So, you know, right underneath where athletes put their name on, say, an interest form, it says, you know, first name, last name, preferred pronouns. And I can't even begin to tell you how many times I have had athletes come up to me after this saying, hey, this is the first time I've ever seen this in the rowing environment. Thank you. I hear a common pushback to putting pronouns on intake forms or registration forms being that it might make some people uncomfortable. In the past 2 years that I've had this be a thing within my departments at CRI, I have not gotten a single complaint about it making them uncomfortable. So this also ties back into, you know, what we're saying about changing how we think, right? So we can approach this from the perspective of as, you know, oh, this is just like the younger generation, like asking for crazy things, blah, blah, blah. Instead, I'm going to challenge you guys on this who have maybe never heard someone use gender neutral pronouns before to ask yourself, one, why you think they're doing it, and two, if it makes you uncomfortable, why? So then another thing that is pretty big, or was pretty big for me as an athlete, and something that I try and I know sometimes fail to do as a coach, is being really careful of the language that I use to address my athletes. I talked about this a little bit earlier about the, you know, it's very uncomfortable to be a trans or non-binary person on a women's team being called ladies all the time. So thinking about alternatives to that, friends, folks, rowers, ports, starboards, whatever you want to use to avoid that highly gendered language, it will make everyone feel more included. And then finally, to something that Holly and Linda were saying about, you know, we've got the inclusivity talk. What does that walk look like? Some important things are checking in with your LGBTQ members and say, hey, do you have space for me to ask you a question about this? So always give them the opportunity to say, I'm sorry, I can't take on whatever mental, emotional labor you're about to ask me. So always start with that question. But then if they say yes, say, hey, what do you think about X, Y, or Z that we're doing? What do you think, like, how do you think we can show people from the second they walk in our doors that we are inclusive? And this is something that, of course, I talk about a lot every day as a para coach, being, of course, you know, how do we show that we're doing this without being tokenizing, without, you know, having the one person in a rainbow t-shirt on all of your brochures, or the one person of color on your brochures. And this comes up a lot, I think, especially at larger organizations like CRI, like USRowing, about, you know, we can show that we're doing this, but how are we walking it? And a concrete example of that being a lot of, being Pride Month, a lot of organizations take this time of year to turn their icon or, their cover photo on Facebook or their whatever photo on logo on Instagram to be a rainbow. But I have yet to see a major organization within the rowing world or without the rowing world say why they do it. And making sure that little things like this don't tokenize your minority members, they actually uplift them and support them. Final thing now, for coaches in particular, making sure that you're educating yourself about the resources out there for your athletes so that you can direct them to them. Say you've got a junior athlete who comes up to you and says, hey, I'd like you to stop using he, him, his pronouns for me, please use they, them, their. And you as a coach want to be supportive, right? So what can you do there? You can, of course, fundamentally respect what your athlete is telling you. Make sure that you are the person sticking up for them, and then go out and find the resources both to educate yourself and to help your athletes. And that is something that I, as a fairly out and outspoken member of the rowing LGBTQ community, I'm always happy if someone wants to reach out directly to me I'm happy to help educate you. There is a trans rowers network on Facebook that's pretty new, but that can be a resource that if you have an athlete who is talking to you about this and you're like, hey, I don't feel qualified, but here is this resource. That is a great thing as well that you can do as a supportive member that is really showing your athletes and your fellow coaches that you're doing the work as well.
Thanks, Rafi. And you also helped get me right to our last little bit. And our last little bit is we're doing this because it is Pride Month. And so I'm wondering if a few folks can talk a little bit about Pride and what's important to them about Pride in this month, not in a tokenized way, but from their own worlds. And Nick, you had some stuff to say yesterday. So what's Pride? What's important for you for folks to know about Pride?
I think a lot of it is about the roots of Pride, and that Pride, we talked about this yesterday. It started with a quote unquote riot at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. And that's the time when we kind of celebrate it. And everybody should know the history of this, right? This was a bunch of drag queens at a bar singing on the night that Judy Garland had passed away, and they're commemorating this person that had been so important to them, had embraced the queer community. And when it came to be busted up, they just said no, and they fought back. And this wasn't an isolated event. This was kind of part of a growing thing. And, we talked about, the leader of that thing was Marsha P. Johnson, a Black trans drag queen. That's awesome. Like, we have all these roots in Pride that are actually connected to our larger need to work together to solve some of the racial injustices that we've seen, and we all have our part to play. And so I think our question is, Pride to me means I'm playing my part. And I can't solve all the problems, but I can solve the ones right in front of me. The ones in my boathouse, those I can work on, and that's what I'm doing, and that's what Pride means.
Craig Wu. Because y'all, I've seen Craig at Pride, and Craig does Pride. It is spectacular. His bestest friend, Kat, is online, and she's like, go, Craig. So Craig does Pride. So tell us about it, Craig.
Thanks. Nick, that was Nick's great words. Hi, Kat. Pride, to me, is just being yourself, just being with your family, being with your friends. You don't have to hide who you are, what you feel like. And just like be in community, and just, it's a celebration. There's just too much hate going on in the world. In this 1 month, if we could all, starting here, just be who you are, be true to yourself, and just love yourself. Just start there.
I'm going to start crying, just so you know. Rebekah, Mac, we are conscious of the fact that we probably have young people watching. We had a young person say, how do I negotiate getting into college, right? So there are young folks watching this. The child of two rowers I coached at Michigan signed up, and I don't know if that person is still on there, but if you are, right? So what do you all have to say in particular to young people who are just getting out into this space? Mac, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. I guess I want to say to all the people who are kind of going through it, be intentional about looking after yourself. It's kind of hard to value yourself when you're so uncertain, but put yourself in positions that are going to make you feel good. If you like, go to a college that you think you're going to enjoy and be able to be yourself. And if you can't do that, find groups of friends that treat you well, reach out. I know if you're queer, the entire queer community is here for you. Like, I'm here for you, everyone's here for you, and there are places where you can be successful and be yourself. I think that it's important to value yourself enough to go out there and get it. And along those lines, every bit of pride you bring, of being yourself, of being gay and being out, that's magic. That's whatever you bring that is your true self is a joy, and you should never feel like you have to suffocate that in order to fit into a space. I mean, I know it's hard that things can't always be exactly how you want them, but I think that as we sort of evolve in this world, there's going to be more and more opportunities. Like, you have to not only wait for things to get better, but make things better for yourself. Realize that there are ways to be happy. There's ways to find community, and we're all here for you.
Rebekah, thank you, Mac. Thank you so much. Rebekah.
Yeah, I mean, Mac put it beautifully, you know. You're powerful. Like, the strength within you lies in accepting and owning your differences. And that's what makes you unique. That, again, makes you powerful. And that makes you special, you know. I think it can be very hard to accept and own something that is not widely accepted by others. But no, like, again, like, we hear you, we see you, we support you. Again, continue to reach out to those that you know, or those that, you know, you may see on Instagram or other social media platforms, to find that community, because there is community out there, as, you know, you've seen with all of us. And there's community that has different identities, different backgrounds, races, you know, like that. You can find someone that looks like you. And I think that's important. Visibility is important. And by coming out and accepting and loving who you are, like, you are adding to that visibility, and you in turn will help, you know, the next generation of queer people out there.
Thanks. I want to sum this up by going back to pointing out that athletics, it has been women who have led the way on all this sort of stuff. It is women who've created that space. It's women who've done it. And so I'm going to sort of offer some thanks and pride of place here, both to Simone and to Holly. And I would love to hear what the two of you feel pride is for you in your life. Simone, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Charlie. I was recently asked to describe what pride was to me, and it's interesting. I at my age, I hadn't really given it as much thought, probably because it's been such a long process. But I think for me, coming from a small town in North Dakota and always having to hide, in plain sight, basically. I mean, people may know that about you, but nobody really asks you about it, or nobody really embraces that. And that was in Montana, Washington State, and Idaho, and the other states that I've lived in before I came to Chicago. So my first Pride Parade in Chicago was mind-blowing. It was, there was so many different walks of life, and there were so many people just being themselves and dancing and working. Exactly. And there was the fan phase. And I think that as an aging athlete, I think that the best thing that we can do for the youth or people that are coming up is to because you never really know who's watching. So to embrace your powerful self and to just walk proudly and be who you are without apology. And I think that finally at my age, I've been able to have the luxury of being able to do that. And I don't look over my shoulder as much and wonder what people are thinking or how they're reacting to me. I just embrace my powerful self. And I hope that some young person sees that and that they feel that there's hope and that they can do that for themselves as well.
Thanks,
So
Simone.
that's too bad. Thank you, Charlie.
Holly, have you had time to think?
I don't know how to say it better than that, Simone. That was really great. I haven't thought so much about pride, but I can see the difference in myself over time is huge. To rarely opening my mouth and speaking. I had teammates who said, you know, I wasn't even sure if you spoke English. You're so quiet. And just finally understanding what power is. It's not power over, it's power to. And I have finally gotten to a point where I'm not so self-absorbed that I'm not looking for what other people need. And I've been reading a book, and I'll finish with this. There's a quote by Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, who said that ultimately the only power to which man should aspire is that which he exercises over himself. And that from that is where power to help and to be a part of humanity and make sure it stays that way, that's where it comes from, not the power over. Anyway.
Thanks. So one of the slogans that's gone through sort of the gay community is "it gets better," and it's problematic because sometimes it doesn't get better. But I think what we've seen collectively is that it is getting better. It is getting better in rowing. It's getting better in the world. We're in a moment where we're being asked to make it better, but things don't get better just by themselves. A 2K erg doesn't pull itself. You don't get better on your 2K just by saying, it gets better. There's work to do. So we challenge folks to if your 2K wants to get faster, you gotta do your steady state every day. If you don't do your steady state, if you don't have a base in place, that 2K is not getting faster. If we want this world to be a better place in rowing and beyond rowing, we got to go in and do our little steady work every single day so that we can have the big days where we really do move things forward, right? So enough rowing. I saw Kevin Harris smiling about that, so that made for me. So our part of this is done, and we want to thank you and say Happy Pride. We do want to thank a couple of organizations, the Equality Coaching Alliance, of which a number of us are members, which is an organization for LGBTQ and our friends coaches at primarily the college, coaches and administrators primarily at the college and professional elite level, some junior coaches in there too. If that's somebody you would like to connect to, we'll make sure that Chris has that. There's also an organization called Go Athletes, which is for LGBTQ and their friend athletes. Includes a lot of current college athletes, but also folks who were athletes in college and now are out. And both those organizations are working on networking and support. And we also want to thank USRowing. I know that a lot of us have a difficult relationship with USRowing on all sorts of levels. I just want to say I spent a lot of time in the last couple of weeks talking with Chris Chase. I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of weeks talking with Brett. And Brett I've known since she was a freshman at Michigan, so for many years. And there really are some folks at USRowing who are really trying to lead things forward. And we need to be supportive of that because, hey, it's rowing and we know the community we're in and we know that there's going to be backlash, right? So we need to support folks as much as we can and help folks do the right thing. So Chris, what are some next steps that USRowing is going to take and what's coming up later?
Well, geez, a lot of steps. Anita DeFrance gave some great advice to Patrick, and she said that none of this matters unless you follow through. And I think, promises and words are empty if you don't follow through. And rather than make any promises on behalf of my bosses, I can only just say that, from my own, what I can do, they say you must be the change you want to see in the world, right? Gandhi, famous Gandhi quote. We have a platform that for whatever reason has taken off during COVID, and that's this. It's powerful to have been part of last Friday's webinar with the Black coaches and athletes, and it's powerful to be here and watch so many people from so many different walks of life come together and support each other. You can just look at the screen and see you all and see the love and support that you give. And it wouldn't be such a stretch to think that everybody could do the same. So, for my part, this platform, the ability to get messages out, the ability to bring people together and create, I offer that. I offer, the opportunity just because I have, we probably all have Zooms now, but, this one's getting worn out. Any topics that we come up with, we let's do it. In terms of, the USRowing website, we have a vehicle to aggregate loads of resources and make them available to everybody in one place. I think that you guys have offered your time and you've offered the ability for people to reach out to you. I don't claim to have any of the answers, but I certainly would like to try to bring everybody together to find some. I'm not even sure if there are exactly right answers and one size fits all solutions, but man, it's powerful. I could say a lot about all of you in different ways, but for our young people, and we always say it's about the kids, right? Especially rowing. Oh, it's all about the kids, but, so worn out. To see some of you young people, Rebekah, Mac, Charlotte, Liam, I'm proud of you. You came from hometown, man. So proud of you tonight, listening to you speak. Rebekah and Mac and Charlotte, it's amazing to see the strength that you have. And I don't know if you have always felt that you've had it within, but you certainly have it without. And these young people, they need you. It's spectacular to see you here together and showing that strength. And so we need to show it more of it. And so I will do my best to honor Anita DeFrance's command that follow through. And wherever that leads, I don't know, but we will go through to there. And as long as I'm working here, you'll have me. And so I don't want to make promises on anybody else. I'll just say for me, that's what you have.
So thank you so much. Thank you to all of the panelists. Thanks to folks who've hung out. Thanks to Chris for recording it, so it's now there for posterity. And let's just go make the world a better place. Happy Pride.
Everybody, I will make this will be, the recording will be available everywhere that we can put it up. And I'll also send it out to you all on the email list that people who registered tonight. And, you know, please send it far and wide.
Happy Pride, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.